All right. So please tell us your name.
Johnson Gibbs.
Johnson Gibbs. And Johnson and I met a couple of hours ago at Homeward Bound, where I was giving the book Homeless in Marin, and we got into a little conversation, and I appreciated your interest in the book. And also, in my research and exploring homelessness in Marin, one of the hardest things to get is useful data. And Johnson, began talking immediately, and it was clear that, there was, a lot of interesting data points that we could kind of try and string together and look at some patterns. And what is your situation right now? Are you housed at Homeward Bound? What does housing look like for you right now?
I am staying in a shelter in Novato, and I was placed there from jail.
Okay. And what was the basis for that? How does that?
I had an interaction with the police, and a terroristic threat charge was filed against me, and initially I was in jail for 3 months and eventually released on my own recognizance due to the difficulty in conducting a trial during the pandemic.
I see. All right. And where were you housed before that?
I was staying with my family.
Okay. And you mentioned that you're a veteran. Tell me a little bit about your veteran history.
I joined the Marine Corps in 1998, was discharged in 2002, and had a fairly routine experience as far as training and worldly conflicts are concerned, in my opinion.
All right. And after being in the Marines, what was your housing kind of history, and where you were and how you were housed post Marines?
I had a few sources of support as a veteran, which I was able to use to supplement my need for income. And I also began to develop a business. And so my housing needs were stressful. However, I was able to generally find housing. And as my career developed, I didn't struggle at all.
All right. So you left the Marines, and they housed you, presumably, when you were in the Marines?
Yes.
And so what was your first, you walk out the door of the Marines, like, where do you go from there?
From there, you're basically released as an active duty individual, and you're free to conduct your life. You still may have future obligations according to the terms of your contract. However, you've been discharged, and you're simply now a civilian.
Okay. And so, so you walk out the door there. How do you transition from the Marines into your first place to sleep?
Oh, Craigslist.
Okay.
I believe I initially went home, and then it's just a search for housing, same way as anyone else. There's no help or anything. I haven't struggled with any of that. I was able to transition well, I believe.
Okay. And do you still get a salary or of some kind from the Marines?
I do.
Okay. And what is that amount?
It's not a salary of any kind, but it is disability compensation.
Okay.
It's similar to any sort of social benefit that other people get.
All right. So you get a monthly disability check?
Yes.
Are you comfortable sharing the amount?
No.
Okay. I'm just trying to kind of piece together how easy it would be to.
Well, it's a little over $600, but that's not something I would want to share. I do it just because I respect your need for information.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's useful because, with me not knowing anything, I can clearly see that, I think low-cost housing in Marin starts at around $2,200, something like that is, an average low-cost rent. And so obviously you're not able to leverage that into housing and eating in Marin.
No, it helps. It helps in little ways, and it is significant to me substantially, considering I have not been able to work or proceed with my life lately. And but in no way is it enough to support yourself in a comfortable way. It's no, you can survive.
Right. Now, okay, and the disability, did that come from during service, or how does that, like, I don't know how finances work.
I believe it's the same as any normal disability. Some are service related, others have just been a product of life and getting older. And so one of the benefits of being a veteran is that you have some amount of medical care.
And what happens if you get sick around the globe, if you're traveling and needed a hospital visit in Thailand, for example? What would your veteran medical kick in any way in that situation?
Not that I could imagine. And it's similar here in the United States, where I may be compelled to go to an urgent care center. I couldn't speak for what I would do in another place unless I was there. But typically it's up to me to find medical care in that way.
Okay, but in the U.S., the medical care, is that exclusively if you go to, for example, a veterans hospital?
Yeah, I haven't gone, to be honest with you. I avoid the hospital to the extent that I possibly can. And the few times I have gone, I've only dealt with veterans administrations and their urgent care centers. And so I couldn't tell you how a different hospital would administer the claim of a veteran saying he had veterans insurance. I don't know.
Okay. And does that health, if you go to a veterans hospital, let's say you broke your leg or something and you went to a veterans hospital, would you be out of pocket any money, or would they get you splinted up and casted and all that?
They've yet to charge me for any of my visits. I've had X-rays done. I've had some rehabilitation done. Never received a bill. No, I actually feel very lucky.
Okay. So, and the disability, presumably you have to go through some process of demonstrating an inability to do something. Is that some disability like PTSD, or is that a physical, mechanical? What's the disabilities that you're dealing with?
Mine have been a shoulder injury, a knee injury, and a hip injury.
And was that anything associated with the Marines?
Yes, one of them, and then the others progressed throughout my life. My leg, my knee, and my hip definitely progressed towards the end of the Marine Corps. I had other ailments too. But, they just try to basically accommodate you as best they can. And if I have, like, for instance, sometimes I develop a rash, and that could be something that they would take into consideration. It really depends, I could hurt myself skateboarding and feel confident. I at least have some confidence that whatever injury I may receive, I'll be thought of in some way. So in a sense, it's like having insurance.
Okay. And that's worth around $400, I think, a month. I mean, that's the, I think you said that you were 48. I'm 46. If I scout around for, a $7,000 deductible, I'm going to be paying $400 to $500 a month in insurance. And so kind of directly and indirectly, it sounds like the association with the Marines is delivering about $1,000 worth of benefits.
Yeah, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really haven't worked out the calculations in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that your family had a military background, and so tell me about the family history in the military.
Family history in the military. I wish I could give you a really accurate and prolonged, history of that. However, I would say most relevantly, it would just be the internship of my father's side of the family during World War II. However, at the time, they were civilians living in the Philippines and were eventually, at the very beginning of the war, interned. And
What does interned mean in this context?
in this context, it means that they were placed into Santo Tomas prison near Manila for the duration of the war.
By
the Japanese.
So they were imprisoned by the Japanese in the Philippines. That was your father?
My father, my grandmother, and my grandfather, and with my uncles and aunt.
And do you know how much trauma there was for them in that situation, what they experienced?
My grandparents never spoke of it, while my father told me he was treated well.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And what is your exposure to the paradigm and work with PTSD? Do you know what it is? How familiar are you with that paradigm?
It's been discussed. To not know of the concept of PTSD would be pretty naive. I believe I've experienced it of my own due to certain traumas in my own life. And through that, I try to relate to how other people may be experiencing the results of their own traumas. Mm-hmm. However, some circumstances are difficult to imagine. Right. And probably the ones that give you PTSD couldn't characterize that better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you read any of the books on PTSD and trauma?
No.
Okay. Well, there's a good book called The Body Keeps the Score. Do you use Audible at all?
I do not. I've used Kindle, which I believe is a similar.
Audible is, has a professional narrator narrate the book unabridged. And they cost similar. They're both owned by Amazon. Audible, if you get 20 titles a year, which costs around $200, they'll only cost $9.95. If you buy the audiobooks and aren't buying, well, you can buy credits, and a credit will let you buy any book. And if you buy them in batches, then you can get them for $9.95. But I've found it very useful, particularly when going through PTSD in its kind of intensity myself. I couldn't look at a page and stay focused, but I could relax and listen to a voice. And so I found Audible to be helpful. The Body Keeps the Score is one of the best overviews of trauma and its kind of history in different countries. But the simple way of saying it is that when you have an identity that is your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Your body is part of your being, but your thought patterns, your emotional patterns, your speaking patterns, your behavior patterns. This is your coherent identity. It's a repeating pattern where most of your identity repeats on a daily basis. You just think similar thoughts, feel similar things, say similar things, and you can recognize yourself because it's a repeating pattern. You say, I'm this person because I've been saying these things before, and I'm still saying them, and that's me. I recognize that pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And your pattern is an evolving pattern that emerges out of an ecological context. You're hanging out with certain people, they reward you for certain things, they punish you for certain things, in different ways. And so you meet needs by developing this pattern of identity. And then what a trauma is it's an energy pattern that is bigger than you are, that is out of your control, that collides, that kind of hits your identity and interrupts your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. A financial trauma interrupts your whole pattern of spending and earning money. A social trauma interrupts all your patterns of engaging with others. Like going to prison is a social trauma because you were talking with this person, doing this with this. That was your identity. But then people come over by force and handcuff you and take you out of your identity and put you in a new pattern. And when it's not done voluntarily, and you don't have the ability to assert your existing pattern of identity, you experience the trauma of having your identity ripped away from you, shattered, so to speak. And so it's, in any context, if you're an orchestra and you're playing a symphony and someone throws a big brick, into the middle and bangs into the cello, and everyone stops playing, then the identity of that symphony has been shattered. So anything that shatters a pattern that you don't have control over is a trauma. And so you can have traumas on just one dimension. And that feeling of being unable to reassemble who you were or who you are and not knowing then who you have to be in this new environment, that's what creates this, this major biological memory where you can, get fixated on the last moment where you could hold on to your identity, your pattern, and that pattern's just dissolving. And when that feels helpless, painful, frightening, out of control, but it happens anyways, when it's a superior force, that's trauma. And when it gets caught in a loop in the body where it's just too big and difficult to process and you remember it over and over again, then that's PTSD. And because it's bigger than your identity, you need help from other people to put yourself back together, to develop a new identity. Just like if a truck ran into you and scattered bits of you around, you would need help with getting to the hospital and putting that back together. So that's kind of a very short awareness of, what trauma is. And it's an important distinction to know what is and isn't traumatic in our lives, because we need help when there's trauma involved. and it's not always a physical violence. So anyway, I found that book, The Body Keeps the Score, to be useful. And one of the things that they say is, because traditionally you would go to a therapist to deal with just about anything if you have anxiety or fear, but it's actually not good to re-talk about and relive certain traumatic events without help and guidance. And so one of the things that reason I'm checking in around this is if your body starts to go into fight, flight, freeze type feelings, it's a cue that we're getting near to events that were or are traumatizing, meaning they're events in which your pattern of being was violated or shattered in some way. And it's good to be sensitive around that. And so if you let me know at any point, that you start to feel any of those sensations in your body, then we can stop going into that area, because it's not generally constructive to relive a trauma. So, does any of that make any sense?
Yeah, I appreciate you giving me some way of objecting to probing into things I wouldn't want to talk about.
Great. So your father said he was treated well. There was obviously some trauma in terms of having their whole life changed by going to prison, but it sounds like he wasn't tortured and humiliated in a regular way in the prison.
Well, he was an infant at the time, so he was extremely young.
I see.
Yeah.
And did he say how the grandparents were treated?
They didn't talk about it.
And did your father in any way indicate what he witnessed about them?
There were severe shortages of food towards the end of the war.
Okay. So some starvation. All right. So that's and do you what family patterns do you think most impacted your life?
My father struggled, I think, emotionally with things. Could it be attributed entirely to his experience as a child? I think it definitely affected his political views and his perception of possibility. Mm-hmm. And in no way could you really even contest his, I guess, what would you call it? Apprehension towards the world. Considering his experiences, were that there really is no stability whatsoever.
So that is one of the symptoms of trauma. Is a stable identity is usually considered to be a good sign. If someone has a stable pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, then that's considered like we don't need to do anything. When someone has a volatile pattern of identity, often in current paradigms, we'll seek treatment for the client, but in reality, there's an environment that is unstable in some level that someone has experienced that. They're then reacting to the instability of that environment. What do you think were the experiences in your father's life that were most destabilizing, that let him know that things were out of his control?
I'd say he had personal habits with alcohol. If anything destabilized him emotionally and psychologically, it would have been that. And had it been the direct cause of earlier stress and also, personal relationships, I don't know. I couldn't analyze him in that way. That's a topic really beyond my understanding.
So, but he felt somewhat out of control, and uh, and often alcohol is a coping mechanism. Trying to, when you addict to a substance, in some ways you're taking control of something by doing something to your own body. Gabor Mate is a clinical psychologist that has done a lot of work with addiction and trauma. And his findings is that, if you offer addictive drugs to rats, they will take them if they're in a lab environment, because a lab environment is sociopathic. You have big lights, you have giants, human beings, that are performing sociopathic experiments. They're not for the comfort of the rat. They're for the examination of the rat. And the combination of being isolated from family, not able to reproduce, being, in an artificial environment in a cage is so stressful for a rat that they will happily addict to cocaine or something of that nature in order to mitigate their displeasure. However, if you put that same rat out in a comfortable family environment in the wild and offer it cocaine or normal healthy foods and family, that rat does not become addicted to cocaine. And Gabor's conclusion is that sociopathic environments, whether it's being in a lab as an experimental rat or being humiliated and isolated and out of control if you're a human being, induce the desire for addictive substances that people in very healthy, calming, peaceful environments don't have as much. Do you know anything about what was most stressful for your father in his life, either in childhood or adulthood?
Marital relationships were the thing I was earliest aware of that would have caused him stress, the obligations of the litigation. It could even just be as simple as a character flaw. I'm really not able to analyze all the different aspects of why my father was who he was. And unfortunately, he's passed away. But to say that he didn't suffer from PTSD would be not to know him. And it definitely affected his opinions of the world. It reflected his experience. And what I believe may have been most difficult for him was that there was really a lack of empathy for someone who had come from that sort of background, because he really didn't spend the rest of his life around people who appreciated the volatility of things. And so his perspective was a bit different from a typical perspective, which looked at these kind of events as being fairly removed from their existence.
Right. It's interesting because we don't, part of the nobilizing of whether it's war or the cult in general, we don't bring traumatized divorcees and veterans into schools and educate the children about what it feels like to have gone through certain situations and how to be empathic and kind to that. I noticed this in my own traumatic experience. Prior to the trauma, I didn't have any idea how painful trauma was. I also didn't have any idea how to respond or recognize someone in trauma, because I'm part of the American cult that does not, and the root word for culture is cult, and the cult aspect of a culture is the unconscious repeating of a way of doing things just because we did it that way before. It's not an examined habit that's, you're freshly looking at how to interact with people in all ways based on the data. You're just saying, well, that's what they did before. That's what my parents did, and that's what their parents did. And so I'm going to just do that without examination. And one of the things that strikes me looking back at my life, pre-trauma, is I did not receive a single hour of competent emotional training that would allow me to help myself or someone else in a traumatic situation. And that's a remarkable statement, because for all the thousands of hours we studied calculus and algebra and history of bridges and history of wars and learned to type and learned to do this, many of which I've never used a day in my life. I've never been asked to solve an algebra problem in my entire life, but we were asked to learn this for our future. But meanwhile, every one of us is dealing with many complex feelings at every moment of every day for our entire life. And we don't get any competent training on how the biology of feelings work, how one feeling can turn into another feeling, how to dissipate a feeling, how to build a feeling, how to use a feeling constructively, how to use it destructively, how to help someone else dissipate a feeling. I mean, these would all be useful things, which I could use on a daily basis. And yet, at home, going to kindergarten, going to middle school, going to high school, getting a job, having lover relationships, this somehow never comes up. And it seems bizarre that we would repeat that level of ignorance automatically, so that just because your parents were emotionally illiterate, you have to be emotionally illiterate. And just because you're emotionally illiterate, your children have to be, even though it's one of the most important sciences. And so, it's, I noticed that post-trauma, there are certain things that I'm sensitive to. And I have to, in addition to, finding a date, I have to educate them on something they don't know, which is, about PTSD and trauma. Because even though a large percentage of the population is coping at some level with some level of trauma, not one of 100 girlfriends has ever brought it up. And it's kind of remarkable, because most likely trauma was a key part of the divorce and relational incompatibilities and dynamics that your father dealt with. Because when you separate from a primary person in your life, your whole identity shifts, because you had a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being with that person. And you can't do and be that way in a vacuum. And you can't do and be that way exactly the same with someone else. And so as you leave a relationship, you experience the loss of that identity. And so that may have, and then in childhood, there's a thing called attachment theory, which is that as an infant, you have a pattern of relating emotionally with both parents. And you either form a secure bond or a dangerous bond, an avoidant bond, or a volatile bond with one or both parents. And the only pattern that's easy to deal with is if it's the secure bond with both parents. That's if you develop a secure emotional bond with both parents, it's pretty easy for you to develop safe, secure relationships with other people and yourself for the rest of your life. But if you don't, you may have the phenomena of wanting to avoid intimacy. As soon as someone's interested in you, you try to get away because you had an unsafe bond with one or both parents. Or it may be volatile, where you're hot and want to connect 1 minute, and then you're cold and want to disconnect in another minute. And it's confusing for you and your partner. But this doesn't get talked about either. And so, it wouldn't surprise me if, if that's some of the stuff that your father had to deal with in a culture that couldn't and wouldn't talk about these things.
It's true. Better understanding and empathy, I think everyone could benefit from. It's making assumptions about people that will either lead to some kind of wisdom or make a fool of you.
Mm-hmm. What were the most difficult things in your own childhood where did you ever dissociate, where you felt like I just can't be present for this? I'm whether dissociation can take the form of, whether it's head banging or I'm not looking at it, or feeling of leaving your body, or just being so terrified you go numb. Have you dealt with patterns in your childhood and growing up process of a traumatic nature?
I think I do everything I can to address those forms of anxiety, and a lot of training or developing skills. All of those things are designed to overcome that. Mm-hmm. And yes, I experience it. But a lot of it is because I challenged myself in many ways. Mm-hmm. And the things that I had no control over, I did everything I could to not disassociate myself with what was happening, to try to be as present as possible and understand what was going on around me, to appreciate any kinds of feelings I would have or thoughts, and to be as objective as possible because of the serious nature of things. Yeah. That was the way I personally tried to do, just to maintain my focus. And I definitely believe, in situations that are dramatic and could lead to severe trauma, it's in a person's best interest to do their best to focus and try to appreciate and understand what's going on around them, regardless of what it is. Mm-hmm.
What would you say would be your biggest sources of pain or fear before the age of 18?
I may have been a fairly fearless kid. I always had a plan because I was involved in things pretty seriously from an early age. Did I experience a great deal of anxiety and fear? Not really. Okay. No, I can't say I was a kid who was really impeded by those things. I generally just was able to do things I wanted to do.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, I mean, society though is not a perfect place, and there were isolated incidents that would cause great fear, I suppose, but nothing I felt I couldn't avoid or wasn't just over with, and not something I would expect to experience again.
All right, yeah. And then in your present life, like what percentage of your week is in a state of kind of medium to good well-being, and what percentage of your week is in negative terrain of pain, fear, guilt, shame, whatever?
At the moment, I'm involved in a trial where I've been charged with terroristic threat. I've gone.
And is there any specialty around that language, terroristic threat versus a threat?
I don't know the semantics of the law, which are definitely significant. And
Yeah, because I know that animal rights activists have been reclassified as domestic terrorists specifically to deny them of a number of rights, including toilet paper in times where they're put into black prisons that are under the military terrorist jurisdiction rather than given a normal trial. So if an animal rights activist lets out some monkeys that are going to be experimented on, they're not tried as stealing or violation of property. They're specifically trying them as domestic terrorists because the draconian laws that have been implemented under the Patriot Act, et cetera, that allow things like waterboarding, they specifically apply to terrorists. So now that we've begun treating, subjecting terrorists to torture in various forms, now if you reclassify an American crime to a something terrorist, you're being treated. There was a good TED Talk on an undercover journalist that went into one of these black prisons just by being categorized, as a domestic terrorist, and looking, not being denied family visits, so.
I believe there are different meanings behind the charge. The semantics of law are what define the law itself, and it becomes clear in the closing stage of a trial where your jury instructions are read and then the law is explained in detail, and the terroristic threat charge is justified according to the law by an individual experiencing fear. So,
well, it wouldn't be much of a threat if somebody didn't.
And so if the individual experienced fear, it justifies the charge. And I've got a felony charge with a strike against me.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so if you make a threat that frightens someone, then you've got a felony charge.
That's what I'm experiencing right now, yes.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. And one of the interesting balances is, of course, you've probably had a lot of fear about being prosecuted.
Every day I live in fear of the police, yes.
Right. So you're living in fear of the police, but that's not a terroristic charge. They're not threatening you and frightening you because that's not how the law is written. So you're frightened every day. I think you mentioned that you made the threat to your uncle?
Yes.
Right. Are you at liberty to explain what you threatened him about?
It was in the middle of November of last year, and in my impression, Donald Trump was conducting a coup.
Mm-hmm.
So a bit of it was political, and it had to do also with just internal family tensions. Nothing to do with my uncle, actually, more to do with my mother and stress of the house and being under quarantine, spending a lot of time secluded in my room, and eventually it just blew up into an argument. And my mom was the one who involved the police, but her attempt was only because she'd been trying to get me to talk to the Veterans Administration for housing and for psychological help, and endless different things. And so we had an internal dynamic in the house that pre-existed all of this, and it basically turned into an argument, and I said basically some pretty insidious things, or one insidious thing, and that resulted in the charge.
Interesting. And you said that both your uncle and your mother didn't want to press charges.
No, neither one of them wanted to pursue charges. It's been justified to me as antagonistic prosecution, meaning that it's the state's prerogative to charge me for the crime, and they will do so because it's their policy.
Mm-hmm. And how much money, do you have any idea how much money of the public has been spent to prosecute you so far?
I spent 3 months in jail. I had an electronic monitor bracelet put on my ankle for a little under 2 months. I've gone through maybe 20 hearings at least, mostly conducted by Zoom. I've had one full jury trial to this point that was declared a mistrial on the 2 counts. And I'm being prosecuted again for a second trial. And also, I am being presented with a different court, which is designed for veterans.
Mm-hmm. And do you think you'll take that option, the court for veterans?
To this point, I've rejected all plea agreements with the district attorney's office. And so if it contains one, I would feel compelled to reject it. I find their terms are ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
And them to be so totally dishonest that in no way would I agree to anything they have to offer.
So that's interesting. I had a sexual abuse case directed that a nonprofit referred me to the district attorney because this was a therapist sexually abusing their clients. And my concern was for the future victims because it was clear that it was happening in more cases than just me. And the district attorney, they asked you to fill out this form online. I wanted to do it in writing, in part because our culture is so, so rotten around sexual abuse issues that I really wanted not to go through another whole kind of abuse dynamic around dealing with the district attorney. And so, I sent in the thing in writing and kept a record of it, the date of submission and stuff, and I've never heard back in years. And I think what motivated that was I asked that this be part of a documentary around sexual abuse with therapists because no documentary like that exists. And it turns out that in a survey, 12% of therapists state that they have had sexual relationships with their clients. So if they're off the record, 12% of therapists admit that. And that's a pretty serious thing because many times people are going to a therapist to deal with sexual abuse issues. And so if 12% of therapists are sexually abusing their clients, it becomes a really big deal. First of all, because you can't go to a therapist, and you certainly can't go to your therapist to talk about being sexually abused by your therapist. But the district attorney didn't reply to that. And it certainly let me know that, if I wanted to pursue this, I had to do so understanding that I would be dissatisfied with the values and priorities of the district attorney. and because I was already dissatisfied with the priorities and values of my family system, which began a lot of the abuse, with the education system, which made it worse and didn't cover any of it, and then with the therapeutic system, the last thing you need is an incompetent court system burdening you with additional pains and stresses, trying to help the next victims. And so, you've had much more dealings with the district attorney. What did you find most objectionable in your dealings with the district attorney?
Their attempts to create or justify the prosecution of the most serious crime they could.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, it seemed to be an attempt to win an argument in court that would grant them a conviction of their charge, whereas I had experienced the event and was feeling like I was fighting for my life yet again, that this time in a cage.
Mm-hmm. So obviously they're inducing maybe 100 times more terror than... So was this a one-time blow-up with your uncle?
I've had 2 significant arrests. Every time you're arrested by the police,
I'm just talking about with your uncle.
No, with my uncle, it was it was a very brief interaction. I left.
So this was the one blow-up with your uncle.
Yeah.
It
happened. It was over. It was basically a contentious 2 days.
Okay. And he doesn't want to see you in jail or pursue charges.
No, they both made statements to that effect. Although I've tried not to influence their feelings or whatever. I've just tried to continue on with my life with my current circumstances.
Well, my understanding is that it costs around $100,000 a year to imprison someone, and that would be more of an average. And given that Marin tends to make everything more expensive than average in its bureaucratic settings, I would guess that if anything, prison might be double that. So you've probably, the judicial system and the DA is probably responsible for $30,000 of public money going to imprison you for those 3 months. And then probably another $200,000 in court and legal related fees of public money.
The ultimate cost is not something I'd be aware of. I would assume I can only make assumptions regarding the accountability of the economics of it all, and I can tell you that when you're in prison, they don't pay you very much. Mm-hmm. To try to determine what is the economy of the jail and the cost of litigation, the procedures, and housing people and everything else, they definitely try to balance their budget. And how that's done and to what degree you would have to speak to people, who are responsible for those things, I don't know.
All right. Well, when I try and speak with an attorney about anything, they say that they can't even touch a minor case for less than $100,000. And typically a district attorney will do things more inefficiently because they're in a bureaucracy than a private company. So it would be worth looking into. Particularly, you mentioned possibly writing a book about this experience. I think it'd be interesting to understand how much of the public money is going towards, prosecuting one of our veterans for something even when their family members do not want to press charges. It sounded like your mother was trying to get you help and force you to get more help.
Against my wishes.
Against your wishes. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. That would be all right.
But yeah, so she was trying to force you to get into dialogue with the veterans, and instead she exposed you to the DA, who's going to ignore her wishes and your wishes, and probably a large percentage of people. I mean, I would guess that if 100 people watching this talked to your mother, talked to your uncle, talked to you, and took a vote, I would guess that, a minimum of 70% would be in favor of dropping all charges and of the charges not proceeding in the first place.
I think the only protest I have to that statement would be the trouble it would cause them to have to re-explain and relive everything and draw society into what was really a family drama and just a moment of contention.
What I'm saying is if I brought in my neighbors, 100 of my neighbors in Hamilton Field, some of whom I know, and said, look, would you like to spend another $200,000 to see this person in prison over blowing up with a family member? Or would you like them to receive an apology from the DA and no more of your tax money spent harassing this family? I would bet that more than 70% of people in an anonymous vote would not want more public money being spent to prosecute you.
It's interesting that you say that, because that then leads up to their justification, and which I had some information I wanted to show you, which is you've asked me what I feel is important about my experiences in life to this point regarding society, economic feasibility of different ideas and approaches towards things. It's really a deep subject. My personal experience with topics that are broadly affecting society is within the criminal justice system. And what I've found it to be is a fairly predatory, well, I won't say fairly predatory, I'll just say it's a predatory environment where I feel personally criminalized through tragic and dramatic experiences in my life that were exploited by the prosecutors and the district attorney's office in cooperation with the police department, the sheriff's department, and people responsible for investigating things.
Who are the key names where you would think these are the people responsible for the abuses?
The key names would be the prosecutor and
Who's
the
that?
people who he or she may report to. In my case, I don't even recall their names. I don't want to state their names at the moment, just because it then becomes a personal thing. I believe this is a generally a general thing, in where if someone were prosecuted in court, it will always be by the prosecutor. Mm-hmm. That individual is responsible for conducting a trial as a prosecutor, and their approach towards that, in my experience, has been predatory. Mm-hmm. to criminalize me and to justify a prolonged incarceration. My experience was traumatic in its own and would have affected me for the rest of my life, and still does, and is more significant to me than even being incarcerated, because I had a terrible tragedy with someone I loved, my brother, and felt that was totally exploited by the police. And so I began my experience in the criminal justice system with the worst trauma of my life. And that was then, I felt, the beginning of an exploitation to justify imprisoning me for the rest of my life. And I felt that they could have been reasonable in what had transpired. However, they demonstrated no attempt to convey the truth or reality and did everything they could to justify the most severe criminal prosecution that was available. And I found that as I had emerged from that, they had set me up with a criminal history to not only illustrate everything that I was acquitted of in court, but to then further justify future prosecutions similar to what I'm going through now. And I don't feel that my experience is unique.
Yeah.
And having been to prison, it essentially exposes you to people who are perpetually incarcerated, where the justification is more systematic as time goes on and much easier to conduct.
I mentioned identity, patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And it's problematic when somebody has an identity of a prosecutor. To live up to that identity, you have to either successfully prosecute or you are a failure in your identity if you do not prosecute. Well, we're in a culture that rewards you for winning and shames you for failing. And so in a prosecutorial environment of, hanging out with your buddies, the jargon, just like it is in the chauvinism of men, in high school and college, talking about how much sex they've had, that's an identity. The prosecutorial identity is how many people did you successfully prosecute? That's your main defining in a cult that labels you based on your competency at work, where success at work is to prosecute people. Their identity strengthens if they put you in jail, but the community well-being does not necessarily strengthen as a result of putting more people in jail. But what you were saying is that when it comes to getting housing, and this is where the criminal justice system intersects with housing, that every court appearance leading up to your acquittal in court was reclassified and relabeled as an arrest or a detainment, so that when it came to your housing report, it could look like you've been arrested every time you've actually shown up for a court case that you were then acquitted at. And it seemed like they went out of their way specifically to sabotage your ability to get housing, which is how would you say that?
I would agree with you, although I wouldn't say it was specific to housing. I would say that
employment as well?
That this is a systematic thing where anyone accessing that system to gain a history of me will then be presented with an arrest history that is created out of court proceedings. Mm-hmm. And what I found to be most objectionable about it is that the court proceedings were an appeal, which I won, and also the timing of which illustrated a rearrest for two very substantial crimes 2 weeks before I was paroled. And so right before I was released from prison, I have
You
an
were
illustration of arrest for what I was initially arrested for and acquitted of unanimously, to include what I was eventually convicted of, which is a much lesser charge. So effectively what they've done is they've gotten 5 arrests out of 1. And they've been able to undermine any acquittal that I've had by illustrating the court proceedings as arrests.
In your report.
In my report. And this is a report that I gained access to because I was applying to housing, but I'm not able to verify whether or not this is something that will be prevalent for the rest of my life. I need to do that personally, and I think it's important for people to look into how their history, especially their criminal history in this context, is being created because people have access to that and or are creating reports to illustrate a history which may not accurately reflect what are your rights, and what has actually transpired. And it's difficult enough, in my experience, in the way that they've undermined any right or every right you may have had or believed you may have had, to compound that with this kind of systematic criminalization is something we all need to be aware of, because you're going to be, it's going to affect your life and how you proceed with things. That's what I was hoping to convey to people, and it's been the most traumatizing thing for me, because it makes it very difficult for me to feel that I can move on, and it has directly affected my employment. I am now homeless. I did have a career where I didn't struggle with these things at all. And at this point, I've basically had to recreate my life over and over again. And still, even though I've been through one trial already, I'm compelled to go through another trial. And this being for an event that happened in November last year, and this now being August, has totally prevented me from moving on with my life. And so I wanted to express that and just hope that people can understand what I'm going through and use that understanding to improve their own lives by just appreciating some of the more difficult things that may be happening.
Are you a hugger?
I'm not much of a hugger, but that doesn't mean I don't hug. And I think I'm about ready to go.
All right. Well, I'd
All
like
right.
to give you
Okay. Well, thank you so
a
much.
hug, and I'm really sorry for all that you're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And I hope things clear up, and your mention of travel and possibly Vietnam, is bound to be 10 times better than what goes on over here.
No, I believe it's a beautiful world, and the more you see of it, the more you can appreciate how wonderful things can be.
Indeed. Well, thank you for talking.
Okay, take care.